Hello and welcome to the Washington Urban Debate League's Junior Varsity Video Series. In this video, we'll introduce you to the Civics affirmative. In this video, we'll introduce you to the arguments, go through the parts of the case, talk about extending the affirmative during a debate, and then how to answer it when you're on the negative. First, what are we talking about when I say civics? Civics refers to citizen engagement with and knowledge about government. This is especially important in a democracy where citizens are supposed to make informed choices about the future of their country. This includes ideas of political participation, including voting, campaigning, and advocating for issues. It includes hard knowledge, such as civics courses, activism and advocacy training, and being able to understand and identify fake news. It also brings into questions of trust in civic institutions, in the media, in government itself, and in your representation. Thomas Jefferson was the first advocate for public schools in this country, primarily to create an informed electorate necessary for a functioning democracy, not for any commercial means. There are many arguments that could be talked about under inherency. I'll touch on a few of the highlights. First, voter participation is incredibly low in the United States. Only half of the eligible adult voters participate in presidential elections. Only 30 to 35% show up in off-year congressional elections, and only 10 to 15% show up for many local elections. This magnifies the power of those who do show up, usually older, whiter, maler, and more affluent than those who do not. Trust in government and the media is at historic lows, between 20 and 30% for each institution. Partisanship and polarization is at record highs. This is partially a result of geographic sorting, where people are beginning to live more and more in neighborhoods and states where people already agree with them. Social media has played a huge role creating information bubbles where people only hear opinions from people they already agree with. This has been reinforced by the rise of partisan media outlets, such as Fox News and Breitbart on the right, and the Daily Kos and MSNBC on the left. Fake news and disinformation campaigns have made it hard to break out of this tribal mentality of my team is right and the other team is wrong, regardless of the issue. Russian interference has made the institutions of our democracy feel under assault and has reduced the trust we have in these institutions. And lastly, connecting this to education, the requirements that students take civics and the rigor in which they are taught these civic values in education have almost completely gone. The first advantage to this case is structural violence. The uniqueness is simple. Women, minorities, and the poor are disenfranchised by the political system now, and this results in laws that reduce their quality of life and encourage their lack of participation in government. First, the plan can change that. Civics education can develop social capital. And second, that civic education can encourage effective participation for disenfranchised groups by providing both information and training. Increasing the power and participation of disenfranchised groups can result in more favorable laws, reducing existing poverty, racism, and sexism, which should be avoided in the status quo. Advantage 2 is nationalism. Let's walk through it. The uniqueness in this case is that the confidence in civic institutions is declining in the United States, causing hyper-nationalism to spread across the country. The link debate is pretty simple. Civics education can increase the knowledge and trust among future voters for civic institutions and help prevent this type of pervasive nationalism. When I'm talking about nationalism, I'm referring to blind support for one's country and a sense of supremacy over other nations and peoples. The impacts to nationalism can go in almost any direction. We've chosen to focus on global warming, nuclear proliferation, crime and drug trafficking, and protectionism when it comes to trade in this case. President Trump creates an easy story to tell here, so pick some recent examples to illustrate this advantage. The third advantage, as it's written, is about modeling democracy abroad. The United States is a model for developing democracies abroad now, but the question is, what signals are we sending out? The U.S. currently reflects anti-democratic attitudes and has a bad example for civics education for emerging and unstable democracies now, multiplying the negative outcomes not only in the United States, but abroad. However, proper civics education and the resulting restoration of trust and participation in our democracy could be copied by nations around the world, stabilizing and strengthening their democracies and multiplying the benefits. There are several impacts to this. The first is called democratic peace theory. A large amount of peer-reviewed research suggests that democracies rarely go to war with each other, reducing the likelihood of war globally. Secondly, democracies are shown to often be better at solving global problems than non-democracies. If you'd like, there's an Africa-specific scenario you can replace this generic modeling democracy scenario with. The solvency for this file includes several options. Pick and choose which ones you like, or include them all as you see fit. Right now, the plan includes 3 actions. It first establishes a competitive grant program to increase the study of civics, providing federal funding to support the program. Secondly, it establishes national curriculum standards and best practices for teaching, modeled on the Sandra Day O'Connor Civics Education Act in Florida. Lastly, it mandates standardized testing in civics. Essentially, if it isn't tested, it won't be taught effectively and people won't care. More solvency mechanisms make it more likely you solve, since you're offering a comprehensive solution, but also opens you up to more attacks and links to off-case arguments, since you're taking more action. Framework is an advanced concept, putting your affirmative in a favorable context, decision-making framework, or value system to make sure you come out in the best light. This case has 2 pieces of evidence on framing. First, the Maza evidence. Carlos talks about how democracy does not visibly die all at once, but gets hollowed out. This evidence allows you to answer arguments like, our democracy is fine now, and can provide urgency on the time frame of your impact calculus. The second is the state inevitability evidence. If the state or some sort of governing system is inevitable, and democracy is the least bad option, we should do the affirmative, not even because democracy is good, but because socialism and fascism and the other alternatives are much, much worse. So how do we use the civics affirmative to win a debate? Well, first, you should read and highlight the first affirmative constructive to make sure you can get through all of it before the tournament. You likely can't. In that case, you should first remove one of the advantages. And if you still need more, you should remove one or more different actions of the plan text and the corresponding solvency evidence. Be ready with examples of solvency and inherency. Examples from your school are a great place to start, and some data about the state of political participation in this country. Have some reasons why democracy is good in cross-examination. For the second affirmative constructive, always have an overview. Tell the story of the case in 2 or 3 sentences. Here's an example. The United States needs to refocus on the original intent of education, creating an informed and engaged citizenry. Extend our case that engaged, informed citizens will empower the disenfranchised, ensure the stability of the international order, and serve as a positive model for emerging democracies abroad. Make sure to answer any 1 and C arguments on case, reading evidence only when necessary, and do some generic impact calculus, including time frame, magnitude, and probability. The first affirmative rebuttal is always hard, but be sure to tell the story of your affirmative in a similar 2-sentence overview first. The negative just spoke for 13 minutes, so it's important to remind the judge what you're talking about. Next, answer any inherency or solvency arguments from the block. After that, choose 1, maybe 2, if they've conceded 1, advantage that you think you are winning the most and extend it here. Be sure to do specific impact calculus, comparing the affirmative advantages to the negative impacts using time frame, probability, and magnitude. Lastly, kick the other advantages you're not using later. Kicking an argument means answering any offensive arguments the other team has made against you, such as link or impact turns, and then extending a defensive argument to eliminate the relevance of this argument on the flow. This means they can't use it against you later, since you've conceded to a defensive argument. In the second affirmative rebuttal, tell the story of your affirmative. Focus on the advantage you're still going for after the 1AR. Answer any 2NR arguments on inherency, solvency, and against your remaining advantage, and then do impact calculus. Why is doing the affirmative more important and more necessary than not doing anything, or any competing alternatives the negative might have? And why is it still worth doing even if there are negative outcomes? So how do you answer the civics affirmative? First, we'll go through the on-case debate, and then we'll go into some off-case options. On inherency, the affirmative is trying to solve a massive structural problem in the United States that impacts people's behavior throughout their life. There are some measures of democratic engagement and participation that show a highly engaged and/or informed population, especially if you consider digital activism useful. The Trump movement brought traditionally unengaged voters into the electoral process. The resulting backlash has also re-engaged a lot of people in the political process. Additionally, some parts of the plan exist in some form now. This is a case that you can win the entire debate on the negative going for inherency, but you'll need to do additional research for that. On the solvency debate, there are several parts to the affirmative, and they take multiple actions in the plan text. You can attack each one of them for its effectiveness. The National Standards for Social Studies and Civics has definite downsides and links to off-case positions. The Sandra Day O'Connor Civic Education Act has critics and, resultingly, research about how effective it was in Florida. Increasing standardized testing for civics also has definite downsides and certainly links to off-case positions. The competitive grant element definitely links to off-case positions about the budget and finances, and also may not work. There are a host of reasons why civics education doesn't do the wonders the affirmative claims that it will do regardless of the plan's changes, and there are many ways to teach civics poorly. Let's talk about the structural violence advantage. First, you can be defensive. There are a lot of reasons why civics education is not the magic bullet that will lift the disenfranchised out of poverty and end sexism and racism, especially without other structural reforms. This advantage will also likely take a long time to show results, as you have to train a new generation in a new way of thinking. Let's talk about some offense. There is evidence that focusing on civics could hurt vulnerable populations, providing you some offense against this advantage as well. Let's talk about the civic confidence advantage. First of all, on defense. Civic confidence could be permanently gone, or it could be much more resilient and stronger than we think it is, making the affirmative unnecessary. Another important question to ask is whether a few classes in middle and/or high school can break through the deep skepticism in American society and actually build civic confidence to the level necessary. When it comes to offense, there is nothing in this file, but finding reasons why global warming, protectionism, or nationalism could be beneficial could definitely be great ideas to help you enhance this file. Lastly, let's talk about the modeling of democracy advantage. First, the defense. Whether some countries should or do model the US is up for debate, especially with other democracies out there they could model, like the United Kingdom. Second, let's talk impact defense. Whether the democratic peace theory is actually correct, or whether democracies do help people solve global challenges better than other forms of government, isn't a given. On offense, there are disadvantages to the US serving as a model versus other democracies, and downsides to attempt to expand democracy overseas. The nationalism disadvantage in the file is a turn to this advantage. It argues that civics education just teaches nationalism, and if we export this concept overseas, it will encourage conflict across the globe. Let's talk a little bit about off-case arguments you can use. This case links to all the disadvantages that the WUDL has produced. The spending disadvantage, well, there's a competitive grant program in there that'll spend a lot of money, and implementing standardized testing regimes and national standards from the Sandra Day O'Connor Civic Education Act will also likely cost a lot of money. This is a good place to run T-substantial to help you win a link. In terms of federalism, implementing national standards and testing regimes are increases in federal power. Teaching civics through federal overreach is also a poor symbol or example of the civic structure of our country. In terms of politics, what standards are will likely be contentious. Expanding testing can be unpopular. Spending money is always a challenge, and the trade-off with other subjects in the curriculum could also be unpopular. Civics education, especially now, could also simply be perceived as anti-Trump. In terms of the trade-off disadvantage, the affirmative is based on the entire idea that we have started to study other things, such as science and math, too much at the expense of civics. Explaining why those other things are more valuable is a good way to debate the trade-off in resources and instructional time. There are plenty of other disadvantages out there when you get to varsity. This case will likely link to all of them. When it comes to counterplans, they likely are effective against this affirmative. The states can attempt to solve civics education now. They could find money for a grant program, implement different standards, and start testing tomorrow. Whether they will do it effectively and whether the states can solve the modeling advantage is up for debate, but the state's counterplan definitely has the potential to be a strong strategy. Let's talk about the court's counterplan. This will definitely work. The civics case neg contains a unique take on the court's counterplan. There is a legal argument saying that citizens have a right to a civic education under the 14th Amendment, which justifies a court ruling in a scenario that otherwise wouldn't intuitively lend itself to the courts taking action. Lastly, you can write your own counterplan. A plan-inclusive counterplan could be a strong strategy. Choosing to do only some of the planks or parts of the plan text and having a disadvantage to the others is a possible strategy. For example, doing the standards and the testing but not the grant program because it links to the spending disad could be a strategy. Additionally, you could do the standards and the grant program but object to the testing because of the negative impact standardized testing has on different communities. Lastly, critiques. Teaching civics can be seen as a tool to indoctrinate students in any number of ideologies, nationalism, or capitalism, or anything else. Max Weber, a philosopher, made the argument that indoctrination through education was inevitable, so you might as well indoctrinate citizens in the right, or at least your, ideas. This case links to the capitalism critique and the biopower critique in the WUDL core files, especially if you make arguments based on the case advantages. The case negative also includes the beginning of a feminism critique you should do more research on before using. Lastly, topicality. There are a number of reasons why this case could be questionably topical, though it is written to avoid some of them. Let's talk about T-substantial. This is likely a substantial change, but how substantial does it need to be to actually solve is up for debate. This is not likely an argument you can win, but can help you with links to your disadvantages. This is a curricular change, so it likely passes any topicality questions on the subject of education. When it comes to T increase, there are definitely increases in funding, but also the creation of new federal programs. Extra and effects topicality are where you'll likely score some points. Testing and grants are not direct changes to education. They are only indirect effects or fall into different categories completely. Topicality is about your creativity and interpretation of the topic. This plan does a lot of a multi-violation topicality attack with new arguments not from the core files, could be a great strategy.